Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding, and I am here with another episode of my Road to the 2024 Mr. Olympia series. Today we have an apples and oranges type of comparison. First up, we have Rafael Brandao. He's a fan favorite, he's Brazil's best bodybuilder at this point, he's aesthetic, he's added a ton of size this year, and a lot of people say he's going to work his way up into the second call out the Olympia. But he does have to go through one person among many others, that being William Bonac. Now I know a lot of you are saying, are you serious? There's no way Bonac can beat Brandao. Well, this was my gut reaction when I put this comparison together, I'll be honest. But they have actually faced off a couple of times, as recent as 2022, and even though they've been at the same shows, Rafael has never beaten Bonac. Their last time together at the 2022 Olympia, a pretty poor version of Bonac was able to beat Brandao, but they're both very different now. Bonac has downsized a little, but he's really cleaned his physique up, and Brandao has added a ton of size, making that 2022 version look pretty small. So like it or not, this comparison is certainly warranted. Can Rafael finally get the dub over Bonac, or is Bonac's comeback physique going to put him ahead of Brandao once more? Let's jump into today's video to find out. Today we will be pitting Rafael Brandao and William Bonac against each other using their Arnold Classic Ohio and Dubai Pro versions respectively. Remember, if you guys like these types of videos and want to stay up to date on this series, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. Starting in the front double, these guys are obviously very different. And for Brandao, that's a good thing because he's more aesthetic. Bonac just isn't suited for this pose. And it comes down to the waist. He has brought it down for sure, but it's still pretty wide. Now, Bonac used to be able to compete somewhat in this shot by having bigger legs and better lats to give him the illusion of a smaller waist. But everything is downsized now, not just the waist. His legs don't have the best sweep anymore, they're asymmetrical and definitely lack detail. Brandao certainly wins the lower body because not only does he have the size here, but his separation is top notch, despite what we'll see from his conditioning later. You gotta give Brandao the torso too, really just for that waist alone. But his lats are good as well. Bonac's are barely wider than his waist at this point, but to be fair, he does have superior hardness and ab detail through the torso. And finally in the arms, this is actually an area Bonac has retained to a large extent, and it's an area he wins. Brandao isn't too far behind. He has the better balance between forearms, triceps, and biceps, but Bonac's bicep peaks are just too insane for him not to get the dub. So Bonac does manage to peel off a win in the namesake of the pose. But we know that the biceps and arms as a whole are not as important as the entire silhouette. Brandao is so much more aesthetic than Bonac, and really Brandao doesn't have a weakness in this shot. Like I said, he has great balance, and in this shot, his subpar conditioning isn't a hindrance. All in all, he wins the pose. I will give Bonac some props here though. I personally don't find the waist to be that bad. I honestly find the legs to be more detrimental. Bonac did win the arms though, they definitely do wow me for sure, but I know what the popular opinion is going to be here, and I'm fine representing most of that. I won't make this a clean sweep for Brandao, but I will make this a very solid 2 out of 3 point win for Brandao. I may have been a Bonac apologist in the last pose, but this one is just too much for me to salvage. His front lat spread is maybe his worst pose. If it's not, it's definitely the second worst. On the other hand, Brandao brings one of his best shots here. For one, he has the structure, he's taller and much wider than Bonac. Bonac is very narrow, always has been. Brandao also wins the legs again easily. He also has a solid chest and shoulders region with very full pecs, that have that nice square look, and his arms are pretty good as well. And lats to lats, his are wider, have better taper, and just look fuller and beefier than Bonac's. So the shot is not just going to Brandao because Bonac is bad. Rafael is legitimately very good here. But make no mistake about it, Bonac certainly does have his problems. The legs suffer from the same problems as in the last pose. The midsection is even wider here, which ruins most of what his lats are capable of doing. Not to mention the lats themselves are just not good. They look thinner than Brandao's, and Bonac's recent injuries on full display in his left lat. Even his chest looks deflated here. This used to be bursting full and rippling with detail. The arms and shoulders are really the only area that held up to some extent. But even here, while they resemble somewhat of his old self, his 2017 version, for example, will be no match for today's Bonac. This pose is just unfortunate for Bonac. It's always been a weak shot for him because he's narrow, but now he's suffering from many more flaws. This is easily a 3 point win for Brandao. We're moving on to the front shots now, and if Bonac wants to make up any ground, it's going to have to be starting here. Fortunately for him, I do think it's possible. Now, this shot is still very, very close, 50-50. I'm going back and forth even now. Both guys have great side chests, but for kind of different reasons. For Bonac, his argument is all about that compact mass and the level of maturity and detail he manages to bring. Brandao is overall less refined for sure, but from an overall perspective, he's big. He's bigger, taller, and wider than Bonac, and just from a glance, he looks better. That's his argument. He has the better structure and is filling in flattening out quite nicely now. But does that hold up when looking closely? In the side leg, honestly, even though Raphael looks to be carrying some water, Bonac literally has zero hamstring drop at this point and is very glute dominant, even more so than he used to be. Usually I reward detail here in the side leg, but Raphael is just too big. Bonac does win the upper limb though. These guys' delts are roughly the same, but Bonac's bicep peak is just insane and wins him the area. And finally in the pecs, this is close. I'd make a bet that Raphael has slightly bigger pecs, especially when they step outside of pictures, but Bonac is really close in terms of size, and that's going to look more impressive on a smaller frame, and yeah, they do. He wins this area though because of all the detail. Being the old guy has its perks, and one of those is that old man muscle. Bonac has it in some areas more than others, but this is one of those areas. So he does win the chest. But what about overall? Who is taking this shot? After going through, I still think it's 50-50. Raphael is bigger overall, but I'm going to go with Bonac for being pretty filled out, but also having the details that Brandao doesn't. This is just going to be 1 point no matter who you give it to, but to me that 1 point is going to Bonac. Now, like I said, if Bonac wants to make up some ground, he has to do it in these next few poses. And Bonac's back has always been very good, but I'm sorry, this is not going to be where he racks up points. Now, we can start in the lower body because that's straightforward. Bonac is much more conditioned, and on that he wins. No ifs, ands, or buts. Brandao has some good size, but a film over his entire lower body, and even the upper body really, but we'll get to that. Bonac is also very complete, calves to glutes. So heading into the back department, Bonac is definitely leading for sure. But in the back, it's a borderline debate if he even wins here. I know some of you will automatically assume Bonac wins here because he always has against most guys, but the Bonac you're thinking of is not the one we are currently getting. His back has some detail through the upper portion, but at the same time he looks a bit mangled. But oddly enough, at the same time as that, he looks flat. His lats used to just hang off his back, and he used to be very 3D. Now Brandao isn't even that far behind him. Brandao legitimately beats him in some things. Width for one, that's obvious, but I would also give Brandao the lower back. And as much as he lacks development, we can at least see where all these muscles end and begin. Again, Bonac looks withered and devoid of true detail, not to mention that lat tear. Not as visible here as it is in the next shot, but still visible nonetheless. And while we're on the subject of the upper body, what about those arms and delts? This is another area where Bonac usually picks up a win automatically. I still think he does in the arms. Those peaks are pretty crazy and they peak just a bit higher than Brandao's do, but Bonac isn't winning the delts for one reason. Take a look at that right delt. Tell me what muscle that is and I'll give him the area. But for now, I think I rest my case. I don't care what it is, but it's distracting. So honestly, there is a very good argument for Brandao to win this pose, and that shouldn't be the case against most people. He's brought up his back a lot, but it's still his weaker link. He needs more development and conditioning here to be competitive against most top guys. But here, he actually is already competitive. However, I don't have him quite winning the pose. I do think Bonac does enough against Brandao. He has a little more detail overall, more maturity, a better lower body, and better overall conditioning. This is actually pretty razor thin though. If you gave this to Brandao, you wouldn't get much pushback from me. So this will just be a 1 point win for Bonac. I bet a lot of us will be split on the last pose. Some will want Brandao to win, and I suspect some people would bump Bonac's win up to 2 points. However, the rear lat spread is clear. All the things I was saying about Bonac's back, how it's kind of withered and he has that torn lat, all of that is on full display here times 2. Brandao's back does look pretty thin, he does lack some thickness, but at least it doesn't look like Bonac's, which again, insert adjective here, whatever you want to say, I'm just going to say it looks withered and weird. So at this point, really who cares about Brandao's lack of detail when he has such an advantage in width and he just doesn't have the flaws? Both lat spreads were never Bonac's strongest shots, as I mentioned earlier, but now his back one is going. He's narrow, always has been, and Brandao is so much wider and free of flaws besides the lack of conditioning. And even then, I'll take Brandao's lack of conditioning and smooth back over Bonac's many issues. There is one silver lining for Bonac, however. Of course, I'm talking about the lower body. Brandao's conditioning yet again prevents him from winning this area. He's too smooth and Bonac is complete. Even with the solid win in the lower body though, Raphael is still definitely winning this pose. I'm sure some could argue a clean sweep for Brandao. I seriously just don't like Bonac's back. But Bonac still does win half the body. And if he wins half the body and Brandao's back isn't exactly perfect, then I can't make it a 3-point win. Brandao still needs development in the lats and thickness and sharper conditioning, and Bonac does win the lower body, so maybe I'm being a little nice here, but I think a 2-point win for Brandao is reasonable enough. Coming up on the end of the comparison, we have perhaps the closest pose. Bonac and Brandao both have pretty solid, above average side tricep poses. I really couldn't decide a winner here, I'll be honest. Brandao is bigger overall and he has the bigger pecs and the bigger side leg, but with Bonac's masterful execution, he looks like a statue. And his midsection is locked in, he honestly beats Brandao here. And Bonac also beats Brandao in the all-important tricep, leaving you with things to like about both guys. Brandao again is a little bigger overall, and I almost had him winning this pose based on that. But I like Bonac with that top-notch execution. And with that waistline taper and the better tricep, I'm giving him the pose. That's just what I like though. There aren't really things to dislike here. It's just about what you like more. It's a close one, Bonac won't get far, he just gets another point here. And now we're going to the abs and thighs, and honestly on the face of it, I do prefer Bonac. In this particular shot, I think he looks pretty good. He's hiding his waist and he impresses me more. His abs don't look half bad while his obliques look pretty good in this shot. Now his quads are definitely always going to lose to Brandau's. Brandau is just way too big and too separated, but Bonac's are okay. He definitely needs to pose this a little differently to bring out detail in all areas of the quads though. Or maybe he just doesn't have it anymore. Overall, Bonac is very impressive in his own right. It's not a traditional pose, but I still like it. I prefer him legitimately, but I can't in good consciousness give this to Brandau. For one, I feel like I have to penalize Bonac's waist at some point just in general. I think a small 1-point victory for Brandau would help me do that, but also Bonac hit it head on at first at this show, and he keeps doing it over and over again. And I know I take the best picks for a picture comparison, but I have to include what he was doing in the actual posing round. His head on abs and thighs is horrendous. He can hit it facing back towards the judges and pull off a better pose. Brandau also wins the quads every single time, as I mentioned earlier, but he also has an actual head on abs and thighs shot. The abs themselves aren't great though, they're just below mid in my opinion, but the best we can even get from Bonac is an oblique shot. Overall, I just can't give this to Bonac. I do personally prefer him, but on a real stage when they actually hit the pose and Bonac pulls out his head on abs and thighs first, I don't see this going to him. I contemplated even leaving this pose blank, but I just decided to give Brandau 1 point. We're here at our final pose, and I'm actually going to split this up into 2 variations since I had picks for both gentlemen. We're starting with the hands clasp pose, and both guys have things to like, but Bonac has more to dislike. Now let's start with things that Bonac wins. Body part for body part, he is definitely winning the chest. He is much fuller and more detailed. He also wins the arms and the delts for the same thing. He's fuller and more separated. Those bicep peaks are especially insane, but I will say the upper limbs as a whole are pretty close between these two. But this is where Bonac kind of falls apart. We can see why I didn't use the head on abs and thighs version in the last pose, because we'd basically get the same thing that we see here, a bloated stomach and shallow, unsymmetrical abs. Now Brandau was also disappointing. He made no effort to flex his abs, but there is no doubt his shallow 4-pack gets the job done against Bonac. Bars. And in the legs, Bonac goes back to looking kind of small and lacks the overall detail in one of the quads. Brandau's legs has always looked big and separated. Some of the best quads in the open IFBB. And Brandau also wins the important factor of width. Since he is much taller, he is also much wider through the shoulders compared to Bonac, which does account for a lot in the most muscular. Bonac is definitely more filled in per square inch. He's very compact. Overall, this pose was, and honestly maybe still even is, winnable for Bonac. He still has very, very good elements, but he definitely has more bad ones as well. Brandau's a little more even across the board in all these body parts. He doesn't have anything that stands out to you necessarily, but he doesn't suffer with any major flaws like Bonac. So I would say Brandau takes the first variation. Don't give up on Bonac just yet, however. He manages to really turn things around here with his crab variation. Is he bigger than Brandau? No, but with that roundness, he does look bigger than he actually is. Those delts and arms just pop out at you, and the detail all through them and the chest is incredible. With all that detail, Bonac wins everything in the upper body. But Brandau does win the legs one more time before we end the comparison. But for this pose, winning all those upper body things is winning the pose. So Bonac takes this one fairly easily. And that puts us in a position where Bonac won this variation, but Brandau won the last one. Overall, I do think I have to go with Bonac for the slight win. Even in the last pose, he had some crazy elements like that chest and those arms and delts. He did, of course, have a few flaws though. But in this shot, he clearly wins with all that detail and that roundness and separation. And with those things, he looked pretty big compared to Brandau. This entire pose was really close though, because Brandau was pretty standard across both poses, so I can see him winning based on that. But that's kind of why I'm not going with him. He's just too standard. Bonac really wowed me in this shot, and he did in the last shot too with some of those crazy elements. We're definitely ending this comparison with a close one, but I am giving Bonac a 1-point win. Now let's break into the overall physique categories round. Each gentleman will be given 1 to 3 points if they win any of these 4 categories. Let's go ahead and start with the shape category. This is 3 points to Brandau. It's just too easy here. I don't really think I need to explain this. So let's go ahead and just move right on to conditioning. This is another easy one. Bonac wins, but with just 2 points. He was harder and drier overall, except in the quads where he was pretty blurry, and Brandau schooled him in separation. And it's a big area, so 1 point will be taken off of Bonac's margin. Now for muscularity, this is honestly kind of close somehow. I look at 3 things here: pound for pound muscularity, overall just who is bigger, and completeness. I wouldn't say Bonac is much more complete than Brandau. Not at this point, especially because Brandau has brought up his back enough, and Bonac's back has kind of regressed. Brandau did in fact win one of those back poses. And if that's his weakest link and he still wins a pose, I'd say both guys are fairly complete. At least they're operating with a similar level of completeness. Bonac doesn't even win pound for pound muscularity by much anymore. And he definitely isn't the bigger guy overall. Brandau has added a ton of size and is capitalizing on that bigger structure even more so than he used to. I think he does do enough to beat Bonac here. Not by by much though, just a point. And finally, we're in the flaws category, and to me, Bonac is the only one with some actual substantial ones. He had questionable knots in both glutes and in one of his delts, and that lat tear, of course. Brandao does need to work on his posing just a little bit in a couple of shots, but really that's it. Now, I really don't want to overweight this category, but this has to be at least 2 points in my eyes. These flaws on Bonac may be somewhat small, but there are enough issues there to add up to at least a 2-point victory for Brandao. I'm not going any further than that, but that still may be too generous to some people. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Alright, now it's time to go over the final scores. Does Brandao finally beat Bonac? Well, yes, he does, at least to me. Rafael won this comparison with 67 points to Williams' 33. Overall, a pretty standard victory for the Brazilian bodybuilder. I do think this will be a popular choice as well. Brandao is not only extremely popular himself, but for good reasons, mainly his stellar shape. Now, before actually getting this comparison together, I actually thought this would be a lot closer. I thought Bonac would keep things at least somewhat close in the front shots, but win the side and the back poses fairly easily. But it turns out most of that was wrong. Brandao won the front poses easily. Now the abs and thighs is a bit conflicted, but those first 2 shots definitely always go to Brandao. But what really surprised me was the side and rear poses. Brandao did end up losing 3 out of 4 of them, but that's debatable because they were so close. I could see the arguments for him winning both the rear double and side try at least. And because they were so close, they were just 1-point wins for Bonac. And that's not what has to happen for Bonac to win. How he used to win shows and place well at the Olympia was cleaning up and dominating in those side and rear poses, and in the most muscular. Now he's barely winning any of those shots. Even with that said though, this wasn't really a convincing win based on the mandatories. Yes, Brandao won more points in that round, but what really convinced me wasn't those mandatories. Brandao is young, he's growing, and soon I believe he'll be thriving once he rounds out his physique. Bonac is the opposite. He recently saw a bounce, but his trajectory is still down. The politics of that aren't good for Bonac, but legitimately we can tell he is somewhat on the outs. He just has his flaws. Brandao doesn't have anything major he won't be able to fix very soon. Bonac has always had that wide waist and he still does. Now he's also a bit smaller and downsized, and he has some injuries. Definitely one in the back, and I suspect one, maybe a minor one in the quads. Not to mention he had some of those knots in the glutes and delts. And these flaws and just the unsavory things about Bonac's physique were really represented in the overall physique categories round, which is actually where Brandao got most of his lead in terms of scoring. Keep in mind, I have the utmost respect for Bonac. He's actually one of my favorite bodybuilders, especially of the past 10 years. But he is certainly past his prime, and Brandao hasn't even reached his yet. Not only does Bonac show a lot of his wear and tear, but Brandao being younger will probably help him with the judges if we're being honest. So not only is Brandao the winner of today's comparison, but I fully expect him to finally beat Bonac this year come Olympia time in October. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. I think this will probably be a video where most of us agree, but still let me know what you think down in the comments. And let me know where you're predicting both Brandao and Bonac to end up placing at this year's Mr. Olympia. And if you guys like these types of videos and want to see more, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to stay up to date on all my future videos, including more episodes of this series. By the way, if you guys are looking for some high quality supplements and want to support the channel, then head over to Arms Race Nutrition. Then at checkout, be sure to use my code Project10 for 10% off your entire order. That's code Project10 at armsracenutrition.com. Finally, with all that said, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.
Gotta get that Lexia.